Let me tell you about my father. My father was a man. He was a real man. He was a tough, beer-guzzling, loud-belching, competitive, and aggressive hombre. He smoked unfiltered cigarettes, for God's sakes. And he loved playing baseball with the other real men of La Vecindad, the barrio of the Mexican border town where we used to visit our grandparents every weekend. It was the 60s, and men did not treat their women very well. The women were not invited to the ball game, but were relegated to the kitchens to wait with the other viejas, cooking something tasty for the tough men to come home to and eat after the kill. If my father's team lost, there would be a lot of drinking, a lot of shouting and yelling, a lot of blaming, and always, always a fight. There had to be a fight. It was a given. If the other team had won, it could only be because they had cheated, and my father would find that one man he disliked, the one man he had already picked out even before the game had started. He knew whose face his fist was going to pummel. He knew whose groin his knee was going to pound. It was usually the face of a man who women might find attractive. A face whose nose his fist had not yet broken. If his team won, there would still be a lot of drinking, a lot of shouting, a lot of blaming, and always a fight. There had to be a fight. It was a given. My dad would find that same man, the same man he disliked, the one he picked out even before the game had started, and he would start a fight. He would find a reason to start a fight, but there had to be a fight. It was in his blood. And if there were no good-looking men on the other team, or if my father just didn't feel like fighting, he would force one of his teammates to go in and fight just so he could participate in the violence from the sidelines. He would settle for that. He would smoke his unfiltered cigarettes, drink his beer while egging on the fighters from the sidelines. He was a real man. When he thought I was old enough to participate in this ritual of masculinity, he took me to the ball game. He didn't invite me. He didn't ask me. He just said, "You're going with me. Vámonos." Man, was I proud. I was flying high. I was going to the ball game with my old man, leaving las viejas behind in the kitchen, cocinando, washing dishes, and taking walks around the block, telling cuentos, ghost stories. But I was finally becoming a man. In the beginning, I was a bat boy, or I just kept the beer cold by getting ice, or just simply shouted and cheered from the sidelines. And then, I shouted and cheered from the sidelines. Sorry. Until the end of the game. When the fighting and the celebrating started, I was quiet. I was shocked, never having seen blood before. And yes, there was blood. There was always blood. My dad made sure of it. There had to be blood. And if my dad wasn't fighting, if somebody else was fighting and there was no blood, he would walk in, he would stand in and start, hitting the guy until blood started pouring. Then he would step aside, big grin on his face, satisfied, looking at his teammates as to say, "See, that's the way you do it. That's the way it's done." Eventually, I started pitching to the teammates who were up at deck, getting them ready for their turn up at the plate. My father seemed to like this. He was impressed that I could actually pitch a fastball. The catcher was the son of a teammate. His name was Juan. He was tall, lanky, piercing black eyes that seemed to say, "Let's be friends." Juan and I were very busy during the game, but when the celebration started and the fighting started, we would hang on underneath the membrillo tree and just watched, or we would pitch to each other, glad that we weren't old enough to brawl with the others. We didn't have much to say to each other. We didn't have to, having already made a connection. But on the last game of the season, our team won and the place went wild. There was a lot of beer, a couple of bottles of tequila. Juan and I snuck in a couple of gulps of the firewater as we walked away from the commotion, but my father stopped us. He called me over and told me to join him and the men. As I approached him cautiously, he announced to the others that I would be fighting that night. That I would be fighting that night. There was brief silence. And then all of a sudden, everybody cheered in unison. That had never been done before. Only the adults fought, never the sons. But for some reason, my father had made a decision that his son would be fighting that night, that his son would be joining the ritual, that his son would become a real man. The others quickly offered their sons to fight against me, but my father had already picked out my opponent. He had already decided, even before the game had started. He knew, and I knew he knew. He called for Juan, who was under the membrillo tree, and when Juan wouldn't come over, his father had to get him and bring him to the center of the crowd. So there I was, waiting to do something I had never done before. Staring at Juan, who stared back at me with a questioning look in his face. Was I going to hurt him just to please my father? Was I going to let him punch me in the face so that I could keep my friendship with Juan? In response to the taunts and the jeers from the other men, Juan clenched his fists and started circling me. And I did the same, but I kept my focus on his eyes. I wanted a sign from him to tell me what to do. But Juan's father couldn't wait. He pushed him from behind towards me, and as Juan fell forward in front of me, his right fist landed a blow on my right shoulder. I punched him with my left hand, I picked him up with my right, and I continued punching him until the blood started flowing from his nose. He fell backwards, and I jumped on top of him, and I continued hitting him with tears of rage falling down my face. Not rage at Juan, but at my father, who I could hear in the background yell at me to hit him harder, hit him harder. I felt so much anger at all these men who were forcing me and my friend to hurt each other. Anger at myself for believing that this was what being a real man was. Finally, someone pulled me off and threw me on the ground. I got up and ran out of the ballpark, away from the shouting, away from the commotion. I ran down the hill to the warmth of the kitchen where las viejas were waiting with their freshly made tortillas and rice and beans. I ran to the comfort of my mother's arms, who would later take me for a walk around the block telling me cuentos. My mother, who knew my father very well. My mother, who I feared must have already paid the price for loving a real man.